This week, an issue the World Economic Forum called the most severe global risk over the next 2 years: disinformation. There's more of it going around, and it's getting harder than ever to spot. A big reason for that is the rise of new technology like generative AI. It's becoming more accessible and easier to use. Now, officials and experts are sounding the alarm on how it's being weaponized during this critical election year.
Digital technologies, social media, and now artificial intelligence, they're dramatically accelerating what had already been an incredibly fast pace of change. But that accelerant has also created an accelerant for disinformation, fueling polarization, adding to the general sense of confusion that people have about the world around them. Disinformation transcends borders. It crosses platforms. State and non-state actors are undermining the objective truths on which open societies depend.
A new Chicago Harris AP NORC poll shows that the majority of U.S. adult voters, both Democrats and Republicans, say they are also worried that AI will increase the amount of misinformation heading into this election. We didn't have to look far to find concerned voters across the country. Take a look.
It seems like people are reading and believing what's online without really checking or caring about the facts. It's hard to sleep thinking about the upcoming election.
Misinformation could definitely misinform a lot of people and then lead them to make misguided decisions or even have misguided opinions, especially maybe with like older crowds, people not as tech savvy. They're more prone to believing the first thing they see on like Facebook or something like that.
It's a huge impact. I'm from Arizona, and Carrie Lake is now just finally facing some consequences.
Gigantic concern, a real threat to our humanity, let alone the democracy we live in.
I think everybody should just get the news from different sources and figure it out themselves.
I'm very concerned. We saw what happened in 2020, and we've seen what's been going on since 2020, where our former president still hasn't accepted the fact that he lost the elections. As someone who doesn't want the elections to be decided through misinformation, I'm very concerned.
As researchers and officials battle the war against disinformation, it has become increasingly clear that this is going to be an election year like no other. What does this all mean for media, tech, and companies and voters alike? Joining us now is The Hill's editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack. Bob, thank you so much for joining me here today. Just to start off with, I see these terms used interchangeably. What's the difference between misinformation and disinformation? Because there's clearly a difference there.
Yeah, definitely. Good question. Misinformation is information that's clearly wrong on the face of it, okay? So that's kind of easier to deal with. Disinformation is when you're connecting dots that aren't necessarily should be connected. And we've seen that either in news articles or opinion pieces, but that's the difference, where it's looking more at deception as opposed to blatant errors.
Right. And, we're continuing to hear claims 4 years later that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, even from former President Trump. Are you concerned we're going to see that election denialism going into this election and even after the election?
Yes, I think we're definitely going to see that, because we're looking at what's going to be probably another close race, just like we saw in 2020 and 2016. Now, in 2020, obviously, things were changing, rules were changing, voting rules were changing because of the pandemic. So it ended up becoming this perfect storm. And of course, the 2020 election was secure and was basically Biden did win. But at the same time, I am concerned that whether it's pre and or post, we're going to have some really potential violence because people get fired up over elections. As you know.
So times have obviously changed, in the last couple of decades. Are you surprised to see where we're at today?
I am, especially when you look back to the 2000 presidential election. And I had come to Washington in 1995, so I was here just a short amount of time. I was in journalism, wasn't working for The Hill at the time, but it was a crazy time as the Supreme Court weighed Florida. But what was very impressive after all that, and of course people were upset that Bush was deemed the winner and Gore the loser, but there was no violence. Yes, there were protests, but this was really, pre-social media, and now we're in a very more volatile, more polarizing time. And I just think if we're ever headed to that close of an election, the chances of violence obviously increase. And of course, we saw violence on January 6th after Trump was deemed the loser of the presidential election.
Do you think social media is the reason why we've seen sort of this increase in politically related violence?
Yeah, Julie, I mean, and also when you think back to 2016 and 2020, a lot of disinformation was on social media. Protests were gathered, and some of it, reports and experts say, was organized by the Russians. They were using social media. So social media, and I think the media has also played a role in these polarizing times, because a lot of media outlets, whether for whatever reason, have gone left or right, and some people like to just watch the right-leaning network or watch the left-leaning network.
Yeah, and we'll get to that issue of confirmation bias in a few seconds. But, you know, it's been 4 years since President Biden flipped Arizona from red to blue. That really kickstarted a lot of this these election fraud claims, a number of lawsuits, calls for a recount. Election officials in Arizona have been speaking out. Let's just take a listen to that audio.
There has never really been anything wrong with Arizona's elections. There still isn't anything wrong with Arizona's elections.
Sophisticated snake oil salesmen are telling people what they want to hear.
As election fraud claims in Maricopa, Arizona are still ongoing to this day, 4 years later, what kind of security concerns will there be for poll workers and voters, you know, not only in Arizona, because it's an issue there, but this is an issue across the country?
It is. You know, people are concerned, election experts are concerned, whether it's workers or volunteers. There's going to have to be a lot more security than normal because of the polarizing times. And listen, with our system, you can, as former President Trump did, he challenged the election results in courts, but dozens upon dozens of Trump-appointed judges said, sorry, there's no evidence here. So whether it's Arizona or in other states, there's going to be real concern because, and we've seen it before, more on the Republican side, but Democrats in prior elections also didn't like the result. It wasn't as organized as January 6th, but we've seen both sides dispute elections. But our system has a legal component, and the legal component, I think, worked and said, hey, listen, Biden won.
Right, right. And, you know, this is a conversation that is happening across all newsrooms, and I think including ours, about how we combat misinformation and disinformation online, how we keep our eyes peeled to it. You know, how are we at the Hill dealing with the growing presence of this threat online and just, you know, throughout many mediums?
It's a huge concern, and it gives me more gray hair when I think about it, because now you can't even believe what you see with AI, and that's a totally new thing. It used to be just April Fools. Okay, watch out for the fake email. It's probably, you know, fake news. Now it's like, is that video real? Is that audio real? And so everything's a case-by-case basis where you have to look at it, judge it. We're the referees, so we have to decide what's real and what's not. Sometimes that takes time, and the media goes, we have to go fast. We have to be fast and accurate, but sometimes you got to slow down. So we are constantly telling our employees at staff meetings, sometimes it's best to slow down instead of rushing into something which could be fake.
Absolutely, and we've already seen a fake robocall during the New Hampshire primary and the DeSantis campaign, or when he was running for president, they released an AI photo as well that many of us, including me, did not catch. Going back to confirmation and partisanship in news, you know, how are they feeding into this? I mean, consumers like to see, they like to hear what they want to hear, and they go to their respective outlets. I mean, do you see this as a growing problem? Is there any end in sight?
Well, I think in the last couple decades, I think we've seen media news show go more into opinion. It's not like there's anything wrong with opinion. We have an opinion section. We have opinion editors. We have an opinion show that's streaming, rising. But at the same time, when you're doing news, I think you should stay out of opinion. If you're a news person, having a take on everything is not as important. But now in this media culture, there is really an incentive to get more followers, to have takes on stuff, and I think that's kind of moved the media into very dangerous territory.
And it seems like consumers sometimes are pressing the media, you know, news organizations to have a take on something, or journalists to have a take on something. You know, how are we at the Hill maintaining nonpartisan news and just what's simply a partisan environment?
Well, you know, the best compliment I get, and I've gotten it from both sides of the aisle, is you guys are tough but fair. So we want to be tough, but fair. And so we don't care if Democrats are up or Republicans are up or Democrats are having a tough week or Republicans have a tough week. We call it like we see it. And again, that's based on news and analysis and talking to people of what's going on. Polling also plays a big part of it. But our growth has been, hey, we're the referee. We're not playing the game, but we're refereeing the game. And I think that kind of guiding principle has really served us well and grown our audience because people really want nonpartisan news.
They do. And, going back to the, manipulation of photographs and fake robocalls, fake videos, AI, how as reporters can we train our eye to see that? You mentioned going slow, taking your time and such, being vigilant, but sometimes it's just simply too hard to do. I mean, I remember that DeSantis photo. It was a compilation of photos, and they had some, photos sprinkled in of Trump hugging Fauci, which, we miss.
Yeah, no, that's right. Now, I interviewed Fauci and asked him about that, and he laughed and he said, yeah, I love that, because obviously Fauci and Trump, not the best of friends. But I do think you have to be vigilant, and it goes back to something I learned a long time ago, before you were born, in the 1990s, where my editor at the time said, if something stops you, if you're editing something and it stops you, there's a reason. Don't just keep going. And it's the same thing whether you see something or you're reading something, whether it's on social media, you've got to trust your gut. And also, you've got to have a group think. You've got to go to your editor and say, well, I don't know if this is real. Okay, let's calm down. Because once it's out there, it can spread, as you know, like wildfire. And even if you take it down or you try to correct it, that's very dangerous, because then people will believe the first story, not the second, and may not even see the second or third story.
Yeah, and we're prone to making these mistakes. I mean, we try to play error-free ball as much as possible.
Sure, no one's perfect.
No one's perfect. Mistakes are going to happen. So if you're a consumer, you're a reader, you're a viewer, how do they train their eye to kind of do the same thing, watch out and take a beat? They're not under the same pressure we are.
No, that's right. But they are consuming news. And certainly as the presidential election year goes on, we've seen with traffic and certainly ratings, even though a lot of people are not super excited about the rematch of Biden and Trump, but we're going to see more people get engaged, more non-insiders. And, insiders, we're involved in everything, every month, every day. So they're going to get more involved. And I think they've got to go to trustworthy sources. There are other trustworthy sources other than The Hill, but it's just like if someone says, hey, you should see this movie. Well, what's the source of it? Is your crazy uncle? I don't like his movies. So you've got to realize, okay, where can I go? And at thehill.com, you can get nonpartisan news, not boring news, a good analysis that's fair. And there are other sites too that you've got to make sure, okay, I'm reading this, and if I'm going to spread this information either through social media or through a network of friends or family, it's got to be reliable. Now, some people will push unreliable news, and they know it's unreliable, and that's where it gets very dangerous.
It does get dangerous, and we certainly have our work cut out for us. It's going to be a long next few months.
I do think for the media, it will be the most challenging election, probably of our lifetime, at least up to now.
Up to now. Well, Bob Cusack, thank you so much for joining us and for all of your wisdom and analysis on this.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks. So what's being done to combat the growing level of disinformation? Here to help us wade through the murky waters of falsehoods is the German Marshall Fund's Bret Schafer, Senior Fellow of Media and Digital Disinformation at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Bret, thank you so much for helping us break it down today. Just to start off with, how big of a concern is election disinformation going to play in this election as we head into 2024?
Well, I think one of the important things to stress is that these are not things that happen in a very sort of finite period of time. So election threats don't just pop up right before an election or during an election or immediately after. This is something that is sort of consistent and persistent. I mean, we've seen this over the last 4 years for sure, but probably the last 10 years, where we've seen these efforts to undermine confidence in election integrity, to question the veracity of outcomes of certain votes. So we should be concerned, but we should be concerned right now because the groundwork is being laid. It has been laid over the last couple of years. to create the sort of conditions that will allow for particular conspiracy theories and other disinformation to flourish around Election Day.
So, like you said, this has been happening for the past, number of years. It's been a consistent problem since then. So, how hard has it been to mitigate the stolen election claims that we've seen going back to 2020?
Well, these claims now are sort of deeply embedded in people's belief systems. So it's not just something that, people maybe encounter online and you maybe pull them about it and they say, well, I'm not really sure about the outcome of the last election. For some people, this really is part of their sort of core belief system. So that's tough to unravel. You're not just going to present them with facts. You're not going to present them with the outcome of legal cases, which we have seen. And that's not just going to sort of change their opinions. So you're fighting against something now that is sort of deeply felt by part of the electorate. And so you're not going to really change those attitudes overnight.
Former President Trump and a number of his high-profile supporters have said that the 2020 election was stolen, that there was interference. However, there's absolutely no evidence to support that. That is false. So are you concerned going into this election cycle about the possibility of U.S. political officials spreading election disinformation?
Yeah, the role of political figures really can't be understated. So it is just foundational for our political leaders to actually have the electorate believe in the outcome of votes. I mean, democracy does not work otherwise. So there really is a great fear that if these sort of flames are fanned by political leaders, that what we've seen over the past 4 years is going to be a precursor for something far more destructive after this election. And we saw that after the midterms, too. I mean, one of the constants that we saw around the midterms, where there are many election deniers running for various offices, is when those candidates lost and they didn't continue to cast doubt about the results of the election, we saw narratives in those states sort of die off. Where those candidates continued to push ideas that the election was stolen, like in Arizona, we've seen those ideas grow and flourish and communities sort of being built around the sort of election denialism movement. So political leaders are really essential, I think, to moving the needle back to a more sort of sane place where we actually do trust the outcome of elections. And if we see, obviously, the sort of key political leaders continuing with the idea that elections are being stolen or possibly being rigged, I think we're going to be in real trouble around the election.
And you also hear those false claims amplified on the internet, when spread on, social media platforms as well. So what does the internet look like without content moderation or content prioritization?
Yeah, I think one of the really frustrating things in terms of where the conversation has gone in this country over the last year or two is there's this idea that there's really only two camps. One camp believes in free speech, and they believe that basically anything should go, and that Americans are smart enough to make their own decision. And then they've sort of cast the other side as being sort of pro-censorship, that they want to eliminate disfavored speech and just remove things from the internet that sort of go against the sort of the mainstream agenda. But that's just like not the reality of how the internet works, because somebody, whether it's a person making decisions about what's being fact-checked or even how an algorithm is being built or the sort of training data being used, is making a decision about what we see in our feeds or what we would see in search results. So just a very basic example, if you go into Google and you run a search for something, something shows up at the top of that list. And so somebody has to be making a determination about what is and what is not an authoritative outlet or a narrative that is truthful. And so, yes, there is going to be some bias there. You will see results that don't always really work the way we want them to. But this idea that there can be sort of this anything goes sort of free speech internet, and that there should be nobody making any judgment calls about what is and is not a piece of good information, just doesn't really sync with reality, because otherwise there's really no way that we would be able to see content in any way that you would be able to process it as information consumers.
Moving on to the work you do, the German Marshall Fund and other organizations working on disinformation have been targeted by congressional inquiries and, in some cases, lawsuits for allegedly colluding with the government to censor that speech that you were talking about. What effect has that had on the work that you do every day?
Well, we've gotten it far less than some of our sister organizations working on this, but at a minimum, when you receive a subpoena or a congressional letter or have to deal with a lawsuit, that's resource diversion. So you're spending time going through document discovery instead of doing the actual work. Then there are obviously real legal costs that come with that. And then there's the human costs. So if you are a part of a lawsuit, if you are getting death threats, if you're consistently showing up in hit pieces in the media, that's really a deterrent for people either getting engaged in sort of the counter disinformation work or staying involved in this kind of work. And so there's a chilling effect too, because then organizations, because of those different factors, are going to think long and hard about whether or not they want to play any role in trying to create a sort of healthier information environment, because they just can't deal with those various threats. And they're going to just sort of over time say, is it really worth it for us to continue to sort of do this research if our researchers are going to be attacked, if we're going to be dealing with lawsuits, if potentially we're going to have mounting legal costs. And so there's been a chilling effect across the community of researchers.
One of the arguments conservatives make against cracking down on disinformation is free speech. Can you speak to the legal issues around that?
Well, at the most basic level, social media companies are private companies, and so they can decide what is and what is not allowed on their platforms. So there's often been this idea that Twitter or X and Meta and Facebook are these sort of town squares where everybody should be allowed to have a voice. And I think most people believe that. But from a legal perspective, to date, most of the judgments have come down on the side that these are not essentially common carriers. So these are not phone companies that have to allow every kind of speech to exist on their platform, because fundamentally these companies are selling advertisements. And so their clients are advertisers who don't want their ads to run alongside hate speech or election denialism. So from a legal perspective, these cases have run up against some serious hurdles. But again, I think it's also sort of a false premise that a lot of the work we do is about trying to censor speech. For the most part, when we look at information threats, we look at behavioral threats. So fake accounts, what Facebook calls coordinated inauthentic behavior. So this artificial amplification of narratives, the use of various tactics to mislead people. So there are a lot of things that we try to combat that have absolutely nothing to do at all with speech. I mean, in my 7 years of doing this work, I have never sent an individual piece of content to a platform to remove it. What we try to focus on are these sort of structural risks and threats that should be mitigated. For example, if we detect a wide network of foreign adversaries pretending to be Americans on a social media platform. I think we all can agree that's something that we should get rid of. And that doesn't really touch on the free speech of Americans.
And on that note about foreign adversaries, we have heard a lot about, Russia, China, or Russian or Chinese actors interfering in our election, our democracy here in the United States. So how big is the concern that foreign influences will work to spread disinformation ahead of this election? And are they already doing it? And what are the mitigation challenges at play?
Well, Russia has really incentivized this election cycle to get involved in potentially a very destructive way. Of course, the funding discussions happening right now on the Hill are pretty obvious of why they have really sort of vested interests in the outcome of this election. But they've also now done this for years in the US and across Europe. So Russia is a motivated actor. They have the skill set to pull it off. They've done it before. So I think when you look at the sort of the risks in terms of various countries, Russia's at the top, but there are more players who can be involved. So China, of course, Iran has some capabilities, but even countries like Venezuela and Cuba, especially with advances in artificial intelligence, they can still play a role, probably at a smaller level. So there's a variety of threat actors in terms of state-backed actors who could be involved in this election. in terms of the challenges of mitigating the threat, it's actually a little bit easier to go after foreign state-backed actors than, of course, if the threats are coming from genuine Americans, domestic players. The challenge, of course, is we sometimes want to think of these two things as existing entirely separately. So if you're trying to combat a Russian information threat, at some point, if it is actually a threat, that's going to bleed over into the domestic space. Otherwise, it's not a threat and we don't care about it. So we can't think of Russia just existing sort of in a controlled space where we could go after their malign activity online and mitigate it without potentially impacting the speech of Americans, because, of course, the whole goal of Russia's information operations is to have those narratives picked up by genuine Americans. So it becomes a little more complicated at that point.
Finally, on the role of artificial intelligence, what role is it playing in this, and what is being done to prevent deepfake AI videos?
So the companies actually have put out some standards around deepfake videos, AI-generated content, and elections. And they've said that this is not going to be allowed, and this includes even Elon Musk's X. They've all signed up to these protocols saying that they're going to do what they can to try to mitigate those threats. I think there will be a deepfake video or a synthetic piece of audio that will pop up around the election that will attempt to damage one of the candidates. I mean, we've already seen this happening to a degree. We've seen it happen in other countries like Slovakia during their elections. To me, the greater risk of AI in the election is it will allow more actors to get involved in amplifying potentially harmful narratives. So it's more about the dissemination. It's more about the sort of industrialization of false narratives, either for for-profit motives or sort of for partisan interests. So it is just going to allow a sort of democratization of disinformation, because you're putting technology in the hands of people who wouldn't have been able to pull off a wide-scale information operation in the past. So the kind of operation we saw Russia run in 2016, you don't need those kind of resources anymore to run a disinformation campaign at scale. You can spin up hundreds of fake accounts quite quickly, all putting out similar but textually different content at once, so it appears to be coming from genuine Americans. So my concern around AI is more of the volume of disinformation and the ways it can be disseminated, and less so around a piece of deepfake content or a piece of synthetic audio.
Interesting times ahead as we move closer to November, and we'll certainly be keeping our eyes peeled for all of these concerns. Bret Schafer, thank you so much for joining us and helping us understand this really changing world we live in.
Thank you.
Disinformation surrounding elections is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it's been around for close to 200 years. Staff writer Raphael Bernal breaks down the history of democracy disruption and helps us get to the truth on some of today's biggest falsehoods.
Texas is planning to secede from the Union over immigration. Well, that's obviously not true. But people who believe former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev might just think it is. And it's not just Medvedev. Russian state media has been pushing falsehoods on immigration, race relations, and election security in the United States. We can ignore those channels. The European Union even banned them. But state and non-state actors are leveraging social media platforms to sow disinformation and misinformation. And the threat is global. The Russian government has an interest in disrupting democratic elections, especially in North America and Europe, and the Chinese government has been active disrupting democracy in the Asia-Pacific region, according to the Alliance for Securing Democracy. There are countless reasons why individuals or groups choose to mess with reality. There's scams, vandalisms, culture wars, just because they can. So let's focus on election disinformation to keep this simple. Okay, maybe not simple, but at least targeted. Election disinformation is old. So old that the term used to describe it for a century originated in the 1840s. We're not going to bring back the roarback. That's the word for a last-minute hoax designed to spread a lie without giving the offended party time to counteract it. In 1844, the Ithaca Chronicle published a fake book excerpt saying then presidential candidate James K. Polk owned slaves, and that he branded them. Polk won that election, of course, and the country gained the old-timey expression for fake news. the roarback. Fast forward 180 years, the roarbacks are everywhere, and there's an entire industry devoted to stopping them. Companies like Logically, Recorded Future, Graphica, and Mandiant, and groups like the Alliance for Securing Democracy and the Stanford Internet Observatory are all tracking information manipulation. The Duke Reporters Lab keeps a database of more than 400 fact-checking operations worldwide. The number of fact-checkers grew aggressively over the past decade, and then it's leveled off over the last 3 years. But the disinformation industry is strong, and now it's using AI to manipulate even more people. It's not just the Russian and Chinese governments. There are disinformation agents using technology to support or attack politicians of all leanings. Most disinformation starts with claims or posts that people would want to share. And the biggest lies, they build up organically. Take the big lie. Former President Trump started talking about rigged elections at least since August of 2016. Running against Hillary Clinton in an election that he would win, Trump told a rally in Ohio that election would be rigged against him. Today, millions of people say the 2020 election was rigged, and they act on it. In Arizona, the Secretary of State has created a full-time position for an analyst to scour the internet for disinformation and threats. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, part of the federal government, has an entire project in English and Spanish dedicated to separate election facts from rumors. But in 2024, literally billions of people around the world are voting in critical elections, right as AI tools are getting good enough to fool most of the people most of the time. It's a great opportunity for anyone who would want to disrupt democracy, and for anyone who might want to bring back the roarback.